What do dynamite, ghost towns, and breakfast have in common? You're about to find out on this episode of Forgotten Felonies.
Welcome to the first episode of Forgotten Felonies. I'm Monica.
And I'm Olivia.
And this is where we take you back in time to rediscover the tales of vintage villainy that time forgot.
Yeah, we will take you way back in time when criminals got away with a lot more than they can get away with today.
It's true. Some of these stories have me shaking my head. Now, being our very first episode, I decided we should start things off with a bang.
Literally.
We're going to take a look at a family annihilation that happened here in Oregon, where Olivia and I live. And so, on that note, let's walk back in time to June of 1909. Welcome to the unincorporated community of Markham, Oregon, located near Silverton. It's such a small place that I could not even find a population listed. Markham was named for Alfred Markham. He was a pioneer who had come over in 1845 on the Oregon Trail. This was just 2 years after the Oregon Trail was kicked off. He had originally lived in Maryland, and then he made his way to Missouri, and from there he made the trek all the way to Oregon with cows and a covered wagon. Alfred's land claim later became the unincorporated community called Markham, Oregon. Alfred Markham himself served as the first postmaster of Markham in 1889, and that was 44 years after he had come over and claimed his slice of the Oregon pie. So he was a pretty old man, I would assume, at that time. Now, his little town grew as a small rural center that connected surrounding farms together, and Markham also provided essential services between the nearby big cities of Oregon City and Silverton.
You call them big cities, but in 1909, Silverton had about 1,500 residents, and Oregon City had about 4,000.
They were pretty big for their time. Now, Olivia, you did a deep dive into the families of Brown-Garrett and his wife. So what did you find out about Bert?
Yes, so Bert was born Bertram B. Garrett, but he was called Bert or Bertie by his family. His parents were Thomas and Permilia, who were both born in Missouri, but they came over to Oregon sometime in the 1850s. We know they were living in Markham, Oregon, at least by the time they conducted the Oregon census in 1860. Bert's dad, Thomas, had a big land claim donation not far outside of Markham, and he was later known as a pretty prominent pioneer in the southern Clackamas area. And here's a fun fact. Bert was the 13th child of 15 children. His mom was 47 years old when he was born, and yet he was 3 years old when she died.
Wait, he was 3 when she died, but he was the 13th of 15 kids? Doesn't that mean there were 2 kids born after him and she was 50 when she died?
So not all those kids lived. Such were the times, you know?
Mm-hmm.
When looking in Family Search, I see that only 8 of the kids lived to adulthood. A lot of the others lived past the age of 6. Only one of the 2 children born after Bert lived to adulthood. One of his brothers, Dr. Richard Irving Garrett, later said that Bert had contracted scarlet fever when he was a little kid and had never fully recovered, and that he had acted peculiar all of his life as a result. Dr. Richard Garrett was about 20 years old when Bert was born, so he would have had a great adult viewpoint over little Bert's illness and changes in behavior. Richard Garrett wasn't even the oldest child. There were 2 older than Richard. The oldest was Sarah Elizabeth Garrett, born in 1852. When Bert was born in 1877, his oldest sister would have been 25 years old, and her 3rd child was born the same year as Bert. The next Garrett sibling was Olive Jane Garrett, and her 3rd child was also born the same year as Bert. And then the sibling that was born right after Richard, her name was Barbara Ann Garrett. She had a child the year before Bert was born. This family was full of babies.
He was born as an uncle to kids who were older than him. Like, that just kind of blows my mind. But can you imagine being pregnant at the same time as your mother?
No, I'm glad we never did that.
So let's talk a little bit about scarlet fever. Scarlet fever is caused by group A Streptococcus bacteria, and even though it's rare, it can affect a child's brain by causing a couple different neurological issues. It can lead to an onset or a worsening of neuropsychiatric symptoms like OCD, anxiety, and mood swings. This happens when the strep bacteria crosses the blood-brain barrier. It's pretty terrible and very scary when that happens. Scarlet fever can also develop into rheumatic fever, which causes heart valve issues later in life. And fun fact, that's actually how my great-grandma died. But I mean, that's absolutely no relation to the Garrett family. Now, because of Bert's mental health problems and his lack of direction in life, he was considered the black sheep of his family. All of his siblings were apparently very successful, and they were all respected members of the community there in Markham, but Bert just wasn't. And it's hard enough going through life as it is, even without contracting scarlet fever and having those neurological and neuropsychiatric complications. Just normal developmental issues, normal struggles of growing up with multiple siblings, trying to find your own identity and sense of self among all of those competing personalities. I mean, there were a lot of kids in that family. And then to be the one who truly doesn't measure up to the rest because, I mean, he actually couldn't due to what had happened in his brain. So it was completely beyond his control. And I'm sure that was very frustrating. Also, his mom died when he was 3, and he was the 13th child of 15, right? And just most of them lived past the age of 6. So you have to wonder, how many siblings did he see die? I know that one of them that was born after him died very young or was stillborn, I'm not sure, but how many did he witness? And then how many of his cousins, how many of his playmates or, the kids he went to school with? Like, I can't even imagine living in that era where every time a flu season is coming, you just don't know who's going to make it out the other end. Now, by all accounts, as was stated earlier, in adulthood, it sounds like Bert was also a bit of a drifter throughout, the little adulthood that he did live. He had itchy feet, so to speak. He had a hard time settling down, and he wanted to constantly be on the move. Like he wasn't happy with anything really, and so he just wanted to keep finding, something new, trying to figure things out. Now, this actually did cause some issues for him. According to the newspapers, he had, quote, used up a good farm and all his money in going from place to place by the time he had died. And he married a woman who had 2 children from a previous marriage, and even that, this is a big responsibility. That couldn't even convince him to just settle down. And so that brings us to Joycy. And, we really need to talk about her background first. Olivia, what did you find out about Joycy?
Okay, so Joycy Bethel Leathers was born December 28th of 1870 in Missouri. By 1880, the family was living in Texas, and by 1900, they were living in Junction, Oregon, which is now known as Junction City. When Joycy was 21 years old, which was in 1891, she married a man named George Brown. This was in Parker's Mill, Oregon, which is more eastern Oregon. George Arthur Brown was not in the best of health, but the couple was happy. They had 2 little girls, Lavilla Joycy in September of 1893, and then L. Gladys 10 months later in July of 1894. On April 10th of 1895, when both of the girls were still very little, George took out a life insurance policy. It was the kind of policy where they only had to pay the premium once per year. 3 weeks before his second premium was due, late March of 1896, George wound up getting sick. The family was living in Hardman, Oregon at the time, and they had gone the 19.2 miles over to Heppner. Traveling that distance by horse was probably in the ballpark of 4 hours. So this wasn't just a short trip to grab lunch. They actually stayed there a couple of days. While they were in Heppner, that's when George wound up catching a cold. They then traveled those 19.2 miles all the way back to Hardman, and after they got home, his health just didn't improve. It turned into pneumonia. George, unfortunately, did not live more than a few days after that. He actually died 8 days before his second premium was due on the life insurance policy.
Wow, that's crazy. So let me get this straight. There's Joycy, 21
Yes.
years old. She meets the love of her life, George Brown, and they had two beautiful, brilliant daughters, Lavilla and Gladys, and all was wonderful between them in Hardman, Oregon, until George unexpectedly catches pneumonia and dies.
Apparently.
It's crazy how, I mean, because the girls were like infant and 1 at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Weren't they? Something like...
Something along those lines.
Yeah, or 1 and 2 or something. But yeah, that's crazy. So 2 men showed up shortly after George's death, and one of these men was Mr. Falkenberg, who was a cashier of the Manhattan Life Insurance Company of New York for the Northwest. The other man was Special Agent Mr. Helmbold, and they personally delivered a check for $2,000 to the grieving widow.
So, George died in 1896. So if we calculate that into $2025, that has the spending power of about $75,000.
That is impressive. That inflation rate is like mind-boggling from 2,000 to 75,000.
You can definitely see why they had a security guard.
I'm sure that was a huge relief to Joycy and her girls now that they don't have George's income anymore. As it turns out, Bert-Garrett had been working as a stagecoach driver, driving between the towns of Heppner and Hardman. And so Joycy Brown, living in Hardman, she and her 2 little lassies made the acquaintance of Bert-Garrett, and they got married in February of 1900. So now they're a family of 4, and the 4 of them moved to Markham together because, you know, that's where Bert was from, and maybe there were sad memories in Hardman. I don't really know. Now, Lavilla would have been about 7, and Gladys would have been about 6 at the time of the marriage. And then, not too long after that, it was about 4.5 years later, they had a baby girl. Little Beulah Garrett was born to now make them a family of 5. When they had moved to Markham, Joycy used the insurance money to buy a home for all of them, and it was in her name only. Her name's the only one on the title, and so technically it doesn't belong to Bert. So it was a pretty big home on a 2-acre piece of land, and life just carried on as it typically did in 1909. But all was not well. Joycy would do some neighborhood washing to bring in extra money for the family, and Bert had been working in real estate for a little bit, trying to really establish himself in a career. But he was struggling, you know, things just weren't working out. There was just something about Bert that made it really hard for him to thrive and be successful. Now, he had come upon an investment opportunity. And I wish I knew what it was. I went through the papers trying to, you know, I was searching for like investors, invest your money here, like anything like that to try to get an idea of what may have come up, but I couldn't find anything. But whatever this was, he approached Joycy with an idea. He suggested that she sell the house that was in her name and then use that money to invest in whatever this was. She refused because this would have been risky, and she had 3 young girls to look after and a husband who obviously kind of needed her. So according to the papers, this kicked off some marital issues between the 2. They weren't seeing eye to eye on that, and I imagine Bert was probably pretty frustrated that his wife had the money and he did not.
Back in 1909, I think it was usually the other way around. He probably felt a little humiliated that he had to rely on his wife to provide the family with a home and all the other necessities. But also, she shouldn't have to give it to him because that was the money she got from her husband's death, which would then go to her children.
Yeah, that was her money, Bert. I get the feeling, just from how the rest of the story goes, that it was kind of like I'm stuck with this guy.
Yeah.
But then, on top of that, more trouble was a-brewing. Now, Bert was now in his early 30s, and he was facing a decline in his mental health. He was convinced that he had a mystery illness, and I don't know exactly when it started, but at least in early 1909, he believed that he was really sick. He had gone to his regular doctor, and he explained that there was something wrong with his stomach. So his doctor looks him over, and he couldn't find anything that was physically wrong, or at least not as wrong as what Bert was describing. And Bert had some very specific complaints. Bert was so uncomfortable that he'd actually stopped eating and his weight dropped dramatically. Some friends even said that he'd been a bit overweight, actually, before all of this began, and then he just wasted away from this illness. So he repeatedly asked his doctor to help him. And, Bert was sure that this was something horribly contagious that was going to wind up killing him. His doctor still couldn't figure out what the problem was, and he suspected that perhaps the problem was in his head, not his stomach. So he put in a referral for Bert, and he sent him to see a specialist in Portland. Now, back in those days, the Oregonian would print the names of everyone who was registered at the hotels in Portland, and I was able to find that Bert was registered at the St. Charles Hotel on May 8th of 1909. The doctor he went to see was Dr. William House. He was what they referred to as an alienist. That was the term that they used, and today we call them psychiatrists. Well, Bert met with Dr. House and told him about his horrific stomach disease. He was certain it was going to kill him, and he was losing sleep over it, he said. Not only that, but he was refusing to even go home. He wouldn't even go home to his wife and his stepdaughters and little Beulah because he was so afraid that he was going to infect them and they would die. Dr. House looked him over, and he realized, this guy is in a highly nervous state, very dysregulated, full of anxiety, but he still could not find anything physically wrong with his stomach. He told Bert that whatever it was certainly mild and nothing to be worried about, and then he sent him away. So despite this reassurance, despite seeing, one of the best doctors in Portland, Bert was still terrified. He was certain that he's going to die, or worse, that he'll infect his family. So that night from the St. Charles Hotel, Bert made a call to his brother. He had many brothers. I'm not sure which one that he called exactly, but he told his brother that he was gravely ill and he wanted him to come and see him at the hotel. I think he thought he was dying. So his brother goes to Portland and he gets him and he took him to the hospital in Oregon City. Now, Oregon City was one of those big towns that was near Markham, and it was actually 22.4 miles from Markham. The admitting papers at the hospital said he was there for a, quote, nervous complaint. Now, from there, Joycy picked him up and she took him back home where she could care for him herself. But he didn't want to be around the family for fear that he would infect them. And so he kind of disappeared and stayed away. Now, his location was pretty much a mystery to Joycy, but there were plenty of people who saw him.
Nichols garments reflect sartorial skill. You'll get more all-round comfort and satisfaction in the wearing of Nichols garments than from the ordinary kind. Our expert tailors know how to produce garments that you'll hesitate to discard at the end of each season's wear on account of the comfort you've had in the wearing. The cream of the knobby spring and summer styles are here in abundant variety. We'll be pleased to have you look them over. Trousers $6 to $12, suits $25 to $50. Nickel the Tailor, William Jerem's son.
So this didn't happen all at once. There was an escalation and there were warning signs, not just red flags, but there were other attempts that he made at solving his problem. Shortly after returning to Markham, Bert had purchased strychnine poison, and this would have been shortly after May 9th, when he got back. So someone who was not named in the paper saw that Bert had strychnine and decided he ought to take it from him. The paper did not specify who this was, whether it was a sibling, whether it was Joycy herself. I just don't know who it was. But Bert had been asking people what the quickest and surest way would be to die. And so they were beginning to suspect that he was going to hurt himself. But, this didn't worry them too much because it was just Bert, right? So a week after that, Bert borrowed a shotgun and he told the owner, Frank Riding, that it was to shoot gophers. He bought 8 shells filled with number 7 shot, and then he exchanged the shells for number 5 shot, which was the largest size that he could obtain. So, Olivia, what did you find about the shot size?
So, shotgun shot size refers to the diameter of the individual pellets within the shell. So, a higher number indicates smaller pellets. So, an 8 shot is super small and 2 shot is large. Smaller shot provides denser patterns for small game clay shooting, while larger shot often offers deeper penetration for waterfowl or turkey.
Okay, that's all very interesting. All right, so back to the story. Now, Bert's brother, who had heard Bert talking about suicide in recent weeks and months, learned of this, and he talked to Frank Riding, telling him, "You need to go get your shotgun back from my brother, like now." And so he did. He went and got it. Then Bert, who now no longer had a gun or strychnine, went to a store in Markham looking for gunpowder. He wanted to buy a bunch of gunpowder, but there wasn't any available to buy in Markham, darn it. And it was on June 2nd that he made his way over to the town of Mount Angel. And there he was able to purchase not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 13 sticks of dynamite at a store owned by John Ebner. And personally, I think it's crazy you could just walk into a store and buy dynamite. And I think it was because of things like this, that's why people can't do that anymore. But anyway, Bert had been thinking long and hard about his problem. If he were to get sick and die, that would leave Joycy and the girls without him. He would leave them suffering, he thought, and what kind of a man does that? If you know that might happen, you need to do whatever it takes to make it not happen, right? No man would just knowingly abandon his family. So he could not just get sick and die to leave them alone in the world. But on the other hand, what if he were to be around them and infect them with this debilitating, horrible disease that would make them waste away the same way he was? Then they'd be suffering, for sure, just like him, and they would die a horrible death like he was facing. He could not do that to them either. I mean, he loved them. No man would do that to his family. And so he had to kill them all. He had to murder the whole family. This made complete sense to him, and he even wrote a letter to Dr. William House to explain it. This letter was found later in his pocket after the deed was done, and the note read,
"All I told you is so. I cannot go and leave them, so this awful crime, these innocent souls, this awful way to die, but they will not know it. Signed, a man with a damned soul."
The wording from 1909 sounds a little confusing to our 2025 ears, so let me explain. When he said, "All I told you is so," he is saying, I am sick. I was not lying. I was not making it up. It is true. And then he says, "I cannot go and leave them, so this awful crime." He's saying that he can't just abandon them. He can't just go and die, and therefore he has no choice but to commit this act. He seems to lament that they are so innocent, and yet they have to die in such an awful way. And then he says, but they will not know it. So he's going to make it the quickest way to die, an instant death that will take them before they even have any idea what happened. And so it was. On the morning of June 5th, 1909, Bert put his plan into action. It seemed like any other morning in Markham. At around 7 a.m., Bert went into 15-year-old Gladys's room and he told her to wake up and head downstairs because breakfast was ready. He came in twice to tell her to hurry up, and then he went to the next bedroom over to wake up 4.5-year-old Beulah, and he carried her down to the kitchen. Now, Gladys thought this was kind of annoying because they didn't typically do this. They didn't typically get up early and have breakfast like this. So she stayed in bed for a little bit, but she got up and started to get dressed so she could head down to the kitchen. While Gladys was beginning to pull on her clothes, her mother Joycy, her 16-year-old sister Livilla, and her baby sister Beulah had all been successfully gathered into the kitchen downstairs. Bert must have believed that Gladys was on her way down, because he went ahead with his plan. The house had been a roomy 2-story home. The kitchen was L-shaped, and it was at the back side of the home on the ground floor. There was a door from the kitchen to go out to their expansive backyard, and from the kitchen door, they had to go down 2 wooden steps to get to the ground. A neighbor, Mrs. F.A. Chapman, said that she had seen Bert out that morning looking intently at something beneath the back steps. Now, at the time, it didn't seem like anything unusual, but there was another neighbor who also saw him the night before, and it looked to that neighbor like maybe he was planting something under there. And what he planted? It was 13 sticks of dynamite. The explosion had rocked the whole tiny town from one end to the other. The whole backside of the house, the kitchen, as well as the second floor above it, were completely blown away. Timbers were everywhere. Every single window in the house had shattered from the shockwave of the explosion. Even the mirrors in the house, they were left in pieces. The kitchen stove, which was a huge, iron stove, it was thrown forward from the kitchen toward the front of the house. And there was one article that said the stove actually landed outside, like out in front of the house, like it punched a hole right through. Now, where the dynamite had been, there was a deep crater. It was 6 feet deep and, quote, as large as a wagon bed. Now, out in the backyard, about 75 feet from that kitchen door, they found Bert, or at least what was left of him. His body had been thrown backward during the blast, and his head struck a cherry tree just 20 feet back. The newspaper reports differed a little bit on this. Some said that his head had been entirely removed, while others said that it had simply dashed out his brains. Yeah. So I think probably at least part of the head was no longer intact. But after his head hit the tree, the rest of his body flew the remaining 55 feet back into their property. When neighbors reached him, it said that his arms were torn and shattered, his abdomen was disemboweled, and his clothing were still smoking. The suicide note was found in the breast pocket of his jacket, and it was clear that he had been carrying this around in his pocket for quite some time, making this murder one that was planned out for a while. Everyone in the community had heard the explosion. I mean, it was impossible to miss. Community members came running, hoping to help anyone who may have been injured. Across the street was the little Markham church, and they turned it into a morgue, and the women in the town, they prepared themselves to take on the role of nurse, no matter what they may be facing. I mean, everyone pulled together. The first victim, who was obviously dead, was, of course, Bert-Garrett himself. Little Beulah, just 4.5 years old, the paper described her as having been left, quote, in atoms. The paper said, quote, the body of the little girl was gathered together, a tiny hand here, a foot there, while strong men wept and women fainted. As pieces of her body were collected, it became obvious that Beulah was not going to be a survivor. They gathered her up, they took what they found to the church across the street. Now, Livilla, she was 16 years old. She had not been unscathed either. She had been in the kitchen. She was found in a nearby woodshed where she had been thrown by the blast. She was still conscious, but the paper described her as, quote, part of her body cut entirely away by flying timbers, retaining consciousness through it all. And I'm assuming that it was probably something from her abdomen, but it wasn't specified. I think if it were a limb, like she lost an arm or something, they would have said that. Now, she was taken to a neighborhood home for care. She lived in agony for the next 21 hours, and Livilla took her last breath at 4:00 a.m. on June 6th, 1909. And then there was Joycy. She was in shock, of course, and buried in debris. When the neighbors were able to get to her, they held onto her arms to pull her out, and they found that her legs had been blown off just above the knees. Joycy was oblivious to all that had happened, which was probably for the best. Her first question was about Beulah. She wanted to know where her baby was, and they did not tell her the truth. Joycy didn't ask about Bert. I think that's funny, but not even once. And she was taken into the home of a neighbor, but not the same home where Livilla had been taken. Doctors were summoned, and Coroner R.L. Holman was called from Oregon City. Dr. F.M. Brooks arrived in his car from Silverton, and the paper says that he made the 9-mile trip in just 25 minutes, including a stop to pick up Miss Ada Cimarral, who was a nurse. Another doctor, Dr. S.D. Chapman, had been summoned by Dr. Brooks, and they worked together to properly amputate Joycy's legs where they'd been blown apart, to try to get her as fixed up as possible, I guess, just in case she were to survive. The doctors also cared for Livilla, just the best that they could. Joycy was not going to survive. Newspaper reports differ on the exact amount of time. Some say she lived for about an hour, others say she lived for less than 2 hours, so it's somewhere in that ballpark. After the amputation, Joycy seemed to realize that she was going to die. So she started naming people who she wanted to care for her children. She's trying to plan for their future because she knows she's dying. And she made a very specific request. She wanted her body to be sent back to Hardman, Oregon, to be buried beside her beloved first husband, George Arthur Brown. When Joycy died, she was completely oblivious to what had happened to her girls. When the bomb went off, 15-year-old Gladys was thrown against the ceiling in her bedroom. Her room was located in the front of the house upstairs. Now the windows blew out, the mirrors shattered, and Gladys knew that something terrible had happened. So she made her way out of her room to the top of the stairs and saw there was debris blocking her way. She was trapped upstairs, and the only way that she would be able to exit would be through that second-story window that was completely broken. Now, she decided to remain in her room. She was totally stunned. She's not thinking clearly at all. And that's where she was sitting while everything unfolded outside. The neighbors were searching through the rubble for survivors. They had found Livilla, they had found Joycy, and they were working on finding pieces of little Beulah. But where was Gladys? They knew there was another daughter as yet unaccounted for. It took quite a while, but eventually they had cleared enough of the debris that they were able to rescue Gladys from the upstairs. At first, she was speechless from the shock. She was informed that her mother had died before they'd even gotten her out of the house, and she was told that Beulah didn't make it either. Her sister, Livilla, just 10 months older than her, was certainly not going to live. The news was absolutely devastating. Later that same afternoon, Gladys agreed to give an interview to a newspaper reporter from the Oregon Daily Journal. The irony is that she was standing in the shadow of the remains of her home as she spoke, and she seemed oblivious to the fact that neighbors were still digging with spades in an attempt to locate Beulah's other hand. Gladys shared her story. Gladys explained that Bert had gone into her room and woke her up, telling her to hurry downstairs because breakfast was ready. She said he seemed very anxious for her to join the rest of them, and he told her to hurry up twice before he went into Beulah's room and picked the little girl up out of bed and took her down to the kitchen. Gladys was still lying in the bed when she saw Bert pass by with Beulah in his arms, but after a minute or so, she sat up and she began preparing to put her clothes on. That's when the house exploded and her world changed forever. She said, "He surely felt this morning that I had followed him downstairs. He intended to kill us all. And they tell me that I'm alone in the world. It cannot be that Mama and sisters are gone. It was so sudden." It seemed kind of eerie to the newsman that Gladys said these things without a single tear. Her voice didn't quiver at all. She spoke in completely flat tones. This was a girl who was in such shock that it seemingly hadn't hit her yet. She would have a tough road ahead when reality truly did hit.
We interrupt this program to bring you breaking news out of Indianapolis Motor Speedway, where today, June 5th, 1909, the very first race ever held at this brand new track has taken an unexpected turn skyward. Before a crowd of nearly 40,000, 9 massive balloons rose into the evening air, drifting higher and higher until they disappeared into the horizon. Already, one competitor has been forced down, but the remaining 8 continue on, carried by the wind into the unknown. A race without engines, no finish line in sight, at a place that may one day become one of the most famous racing grounds in America. And a result that, tonight, remains unwritten. Now back to your regularly scheduled program.
While the rest of the country was in awe of this brand new racetrack way over in Indianapolis, the people in Markham were too busy trying to make sense of the tragedy that had happened in their peaceful little town that same morning. In the days that followed, there was a coroner's inquest held, and people started putting things together. Neighbors explained that Bert had been acting very strangely in the preceding months. He had been asking people about the surest and quickest way for someone to die, which, that's not your typical conversation over a cup of coffee. But they said that it only sounded as though he was considering hurting himself, not his entire family. And so they weren't that concerned about what may happen next. They kind of didn't care all that much. Now, additionally, he had been avoiding his neighbors and other people who he normally associated with. He was isolating himself. A friend of Joycy's, Mrs. A.E. Roberts, she had noticed that Bert was not doing well mentally since his trip to Portland to see Dr. House just about 4 weeks earlier. She went to their home to try to cheer him up, she said, and it just didn't help him. She said that she thought his breakdown was more mental than physical. So even his friends had noticed that something was very wrong and had actually tried to intervene. There were some red flags, but even now, nobody ever thinks that someone's going to kill their whole family. Because who does that? I mean, you see that one of your friends is more upset than usual. You don't automatically assume that their entire family is in danger. So after it all happened and the note was found in Bert's pocket, they of course contacted Dr. William House. He said that Bert was constantly worried about being a chronic sufferer of an infectious disease. So notice how that was worded. He was constantly worried about being a chronic sufferer of an infectious disease. Now, it doesn't mean that he was a chronic sufferer of an infectious disease, but he was worried that he was going to be. Now, Dr. House said that this was one cause for the temporary state of dementia. Back in those days, schizophrenia was called dementia precox, or in other words, early dementia. So they thought when someone was, having a break from reality or, whatever this was, it was like dementia that you see in older people, but it's just starting earlier. So that's how they understood the illness at that time. So in this interview, here's what Dr. House said.
Garrett came to me about a month ago worried into a highly nervous state over an almost trivial case of stomach disease, which he feared might be given to his wife and little daughter, whom he dearly loved. He had been sent to me by another physician, and it was with extreme interest that I watched him. He was in no serious condition himself, but had stayed away from home for several weeks, fearing that he might in some way lead his wife and children to contact with the disease. I attempted to allay his fears and assured him that he was in no serious condition, but evidently he had worried so over the condition in which he found himself that he was already showing signs of weakening. I sent him back to the physician who had sent him to me with the assurance that he could be cured. Evidently, he kept on worrying, and I do not doubt that he was insane at the time he committed the act. He was of a temperament easily worried or excited over such an affliction. I do not think that any feeling of revenge entered into the matter for a moment, but rather am inclined to think that he was seized with the insane idea that it was better for himself and family to die than to have the disease become prevalent with the rest of the family.
So, Monica, can you tell me what kind of family annihilator this would be called?
Well, according to a study out of the UK, there are 4 different types of family annihilators. The first would be the disappointed type. This is when the killer had some kind of image in mind or idea of what the ideal family would look like. And when their family doesn't live up to those expectations, that, sense of disappointment may be the driving force behind the annihilation. And just FYI, the family annihilation can be carried out by any member of the family, but 95% of the time, it is carried out by the father. And then also on top of that, 81% of the time, the family annihilator will also commit suicide or at least attempt suicide. So this is actually a textbook case of family annihilation. But yes, let's go back to the types. And FYI, I'm just going to say it's the father while I go through the rest because 95% of the time it is. So the disappointed type was the first type. Next, we have the self-righteous type. This is when the father blames someone else for what they're about to do. And typically you see this when, the mother is leaving him or perhaps she has filed for divorce or something along those lines. So the father decides that since she doesn't care about the family anymore, then, this is just what there's left to do. There's no choice. So usually they will tell the mother first and make sure she knows that this is her fault. So there have been cases where, they're going through divorce proceedings or they're trying to figure out custody and the dad is finally, granted a couple hours with the kids. So when he picks them up, he takes them to his house, calls the mom and says, this is your fault. And then he kills himself and the children. So that's the self-righteous type.
So it's like, you're making me do this. This is your fault.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the third type is a little bit different. So this one is called the anomic type. And this is when you have a really successful man who's able to buy all of the nice clothes for his kids. He can buy all the best cars. He can take his family out to eat, to really nice restaurants any day of the week. And then suddenly the man loses his job. Or maybe he gambled away all the savings or, whatever the case may be. And now he realizes he's not going to be able to live in the nice house. He can't afford the nice cars. There's no money for nice clothes. When he had money, when he had success, his family and their lifestyle were like this big flashing sign to the community saying, oh, he's a successful man. And so the family basically serves as a symbol of his success. And then when he faces an economic failure,
then they'd be a symbol of his failure.
Exactly. And he can't handle that. In his mind, it would be best if they all just ceased to exist to avoid that entire thing.
So what's the fourth type?
The fourth type is the paranoid type. And this is what you see when there's some external threat that could break up the family. Maybe it's Child Protective Services, taking the kids away. Maybe he's losing custody to his estranged wife. Maybe the in-laws are winning custody for whatever reason, or maybe the dad is facing prison time. It could be any external threat to the family. And the crazy thing about this type of family annihilator is that their total family annihilation is a warped sense of protecting the family. It's, keeping the family intact so that they cannot be separated.
That's interesting.
So, Olivia, what type would you say Bert was?
I'm on a limb here, but I'm guessing paranoid because he thought he was going to die from his mysterious illness or that he would somehow make them sick and they would die.
Yes, and that's certainly part of it. But I do see some overlap here. I see elements of the self-righteous type as well, because he was blaming Dr. House for the murders. He wrote the suicide letter to him. It was addressed specifically to Dr. House, saying essentially, you didn't believe me, and now these innocent people have to die in this terrible way. right? He totally convinced himself that this was all Dr. House's fault, and Bert was just doing what he had to do to save his family.
Cancer cured. $1,000 for a failure. No x-ray or other swindle. The appalling number of deaths from cancer in women's breasts have led many to believe that cancer is incurable. That is a mistake, as proven by the many thousands of cures that Dr. S.R. Chamley has made. Over a third of a century devoted to curing cancers. No failures and no pay until cured is a record never excelled. No proposition could be fairer than his offer of $1,000 if he fails to cure any single cancer. He is recommended by physicians as strictly reliable. No work could be more praiseworthy than his teaching the wives and mothers throughout the land that any lump in women's breasts is cancer. He says millions of women have lost their lives through ignorance of that truth. Also, any tumor, lump, or sore on the lip, face, or anywhere 6 months is cancer. You can obtain the best book ever printed on cancers and tumors cured without knife or pain, free by addressing Dr. and Mrs. Dr. Chamley and Company, 696 McAllister Street, San Francisco, California. The reader may save a life by sending this to someone with cancer.
So let's talk about the mystery of the burials. The original plan was for Joycy and her daughters to be sent to Eastern Oregon to be buried next to her first husband. That was Joycy's dying wish, and the papers said it would be granted. But Olivia, what did we find out about that?
So the newspapers initially said that she was going to be sent to Hardman, but the next day, the paper said that the bodies had not been embalmed, and therefore the decision had been made to bury them there in Scotts Mills. However, it says in the papers they were actually buried the evening after the murders in the Miller Cemetery, which is located in Silverton.
Right. So Bert himself was buried at 2 o'clock on the afternoon of Sunday, June 6th. That was the day right after the explosion. Reverend Stockwell, who was a retired Methodist minister who lived in Markham, he just said a prayer over Bert's body, and that was that. Bert was buried beside his father, who had died a year prior to this whole thing. And it was sometime around then that they decided they would not be able to send Joycy and the girls to Eastern Oregon due to not being able to embalm the bodies. And I am not an embalmer. I don't work in a morgue. And so I just assume in my imagination that maybe it's because since there were like pieces missing or something that they couldn't seal it off and keep the embalming fluid in. I don't know how that works, but they were not able to embalm the bodies, and therefore they had to bury them as soon as possible. And so they buried them instead there in that area. Now, some papers say that they were buried in the Miller Cemetery where Bert was buried, and hopefully not next to each other because that would be rude. But yeah, it said that they were buried in the Miller Cemetery.
However, if you look them up on findagrave.com, it shows that they are located in the Hardman Cemetery beside George.
Yeah, so I scoured the newspapers to try to see if there was a story about them being disinterred and moved to Hardman, but I found nothing. So I decided to make some phone calls. Well, it turns out that Hardman, Oregon is a legitimate ghost town with like a really cool ghost town cemetery. And because it's a ghost town, there is nobody to call. So I was hoping to find out if their bodies really are buried there or if that marker is just a memorial. Because the marker is like right next to George's grave marker, and it's really tall and skinny. So it's like maybe like, I don't know, 8 inches wide. And so their names, like Joycy, Lavilla, and Beulah, they're all one above the other. And then again, it's really close to George's stone. So it seems unlikely that 2 caskets are buried there. I'm assuming that Beulah's pieces were put in with Joycy. It's just a guess. But yeah, it just seems because of the spacing and the size of the stone that maybe there are not caskets buried there. So then I decided to call whoever is in charge of the Miller Cemetery. And I was able to get in touch with just a wonderful lady there. She's awesome. But we ran into a problem.
Oh?
Yeah, see, her only map of the cemetery is literally written on a piece of cardboard from a cereal box from the 1930s in pencil. So this means that her records only go back that far, and this happened in 1909. So she only has records back to the 30s. And in addition to that, the way that they kept track on the map was a little wonky anyway. So she said that what normally happened was farmers would buy the plots. I don't know if it was out of the goodness of their hearts or what, but I mean, if there were multiple deaths or something, they would buy this area. And then the farmers would dig it out themselves, like dig the graves. And so on her map from the 1930s, it shows like where the plots are, but they all have the name of the farmers who bought the plots rather than the names of the people buried in them. So the gravestones, they have the people's names, but the map itself does not. So she couldn't easily see on her map who was buried where. So she told me that she would head to the cemetery and she would walk around to see if she could find Bert and Joycy. She called me back like a week or so later and said that she couldn't locate them at all. She couldn't even locate where Bert was buried. But in the meantime, I had seen on Find a Grave that the location of the plots where Bert's parents are buried, it is specified. Like it says, row 7, plot 16 or like whatever it was. And so it specifically says where to find those graves. So I gave her that info and she was like, oh my goodness, that is tremendously helpful. And she said she'd go back to the cemetery to check it out and see if Bert and Joycy were buried near Bert's parents. Well, we know that he was buried next to his father, but for some reason she couldn't find it. And I know looking on findagrave.com that Bert has a really big headstone. Like it's one that stands up super tall. It's really fancy. And so, yeah, I'm not sure what's going on there, but
we should take a trip and see if we can find her somehow.
We should take a trip to the cemetery. It would be cool to find them, but I still don't know if Joycy and the girls are even there, and that's what I was trying to find out. So I did see some articles that said that Bert was buried in the Markham Cemetery. And when I look that up, Markham does have a cemetery, but we know that he is in the Miller Cemetery in Silverton. So that's confusing. And the papers also, some of them say that Joycy and the girls were buried in Scott's Mills. And so I'm not entirely sure if they even were buried in the Miller Cemetery. So it's just a mystery. It's just a mystery,
I don't know. The newspapers are weird, but, I do feel very bad about what happened to Gladys. She was originally taken in by a neighbor named Fanny Bartlett. So when Joycy died, Lavilla had not yet died, and legally, Lavilla inherited Joycy's estate. But then, Lavilla passed away early the following morning, which then passed the estate down to Gladys. And that estate was worth $500 in real property. And I don't really know what that means.
Like the house probably was worth $500, and so she got the house. So maybe there wasn't like savings. There was no cash, but I mean, they had a house that she got to have. So if she sold the house, then she'd have the money probably.
Yes. After a while, her uncle, who was Joycy's brother, William Leathers, took her down to Central Point, Jackson County, Oregon. And then on July 31st of 1910, she ate autumnal fern, which I don't know what that means.
It was apparently a bad decision.
Apparently. She was sick for the next 12 days, and on the 12th day, she had lesions in her mouth, and she passed away in the home of F.F. Cooper on August 12th, 1910. Her death certificate says she died from metastatic parotiditis, or cancer of the saliva gland, which I'm not sure how you get cancer from eating an autumnal fern. I looked it up. It's non-toxic.
Yeah, I don't know.
But then she was buried in Central Point Cemetery in Central Point, Jackson County. And I just think it's really sad that she didn't get buried with her mom and sisters.
Maybe Joyce's brother didn't know where she's buried either. I don't know. I'll just bury you here. But yeah, I agree. That poor girl was left alone in the world at 15. And I would guess the stress and the shock and all of that contributed to the development of cancer if it was indeed cancer.
Yes, but also after her death, Fanny became the executor of the $500 real property, and there is no info on what happened to it after that.
Yeah, I don't know.
So, Monica, what led Bert to do something like this? What do you think was going on with him psychologically? Because this was extreme.
So, from a modern psychological perspective, this is where things get really interesting. When we look at Bert's behavior through what we now call somatic symptom disorders, there are some really clear patterns. These disorders aren't about someone faking symptoms, okay? He wasn't faking. Instead, these disorders involve a person becoming completely preoccupied with their physical health, often experiencing intense anxiety about having or developing a serious illness. And one of the key features is that the person continues to feel this fear even after medical reassurance that they're fine. And that's exactly what we see with Bert. He believed that something was seriously wrong with his stomach. He went to doctors. He was examined. He was told, "You're fine. Nothing's wrong." But it didn't matter. From the wording of the Dr. William House quote, it sounds like Bert did perhaps have something going on with his stomach. Maybe he had diarrhea. Maybe he had acid reflux. I don't know. But he said that it was really quite mild. He actually used the word trivial. It was not infectious. It was not going to kill anyone. But despite that, the belief didn't go away. In fact, it just got stronger. He began to show what we would now describe as excessive health-related behaviors and also avoidance. So he wasn't eating properly, his sleep was affected, his mood declined, his weight was dropping, and he even stayed away from his own family because he believed that he might infect them. So if we were looking at this today, we might consider something like illness anxiety disorder, where the fear of illness becomes persistent and overwhelming despite little or no medical evidence. But it doesn't seem like it just stayed at the level of anxiety, because what makes this case more complicated is that his belief seems to have become completely fixed. And that's where we start to see an overlap with psychosis. Illness anxiety disorder itself is not a psychotic disorder, but it can certainly start to blur into psychotic-like thinking when a belief becomes unshakable, when it no longer responds to logic, reassurance, or evidence. At that point, it can take on a delusional quality. And in Bert's case, that belief, it didn't just stay as anxiety, it began shaping his decisions. He believed he was going to die without proper diagnosis and treatment. He believed that if he were to die, it would devastate Joycy and the girls, and they would suffer. Or he believed that if he wasn't treated, he would infect them, with the same deadly disease. And that's just another way that they would suffer. So in Bert's mind, that horrific thing that he did was the only way to protect his family. And that is where this case takes another turn, because when someone is experiencing psychosis, they're not just worried about something, they actually believe it. I mean, completely. There is no questioning it. There's no, maybe I'm wrong. And that brings us to something called first episode psychosis, or FEP. Now, experts kind of disagree on what this exactly means, first episode psychosis. Some say, well, it's just the very, very first episode, the very first time they have a psychotic break. But others say, well, we should probably count it as the whole amount of time that they had the psychotic disorder prior to being, diagnosed and treated, because that whole time period is going to be kind of the same, each of those those episodes. So this first time, whether it's the whole time period or just the actual first time, It's considered to be the most dangerous period of a psychotic disorder. Studies have shown that the risk of serious violence, including homicide, can be dramatically higher during this first episode compared to later on in the illness. But I want to be clear that people who are psychotic, it's very, very rare for them to become violent. People who are mentally ill are much more likely to be the victims of violence rather than the perpetrators. Normally they're scared and, hiding from things and withdrawing. But anyway, so there was a research study done where they were looking at people who had psychotic disorders, and they were looking at the rates of violence during the FEP as opposed to rates of violence at any other time for the rest of their lives that they had, this disorder. And something very interesting that they found is that the risk of committing a murder during the FEP is 15.5 times higher than it is at any other time for the remainder of their illness. And there are a couple reasons for that. Okay, you might be wondering, why? Why on earth is the first one so much worse? Well, first of all, the person has no idea that what they are experiencing is not real. To them, their thoughts and perceptions are completely true. I mean, they have no reason to think otherwise. If you listening right now suddenly saw, some big monster come crashing through your door, you would react. You would try to save your own life, save other people in the room from this scary thing. You don't have any reason to think that this is, a hallucination. You don't know. So you're going to react rationally, right, to that situation, not knowing that it's not real. The second reason would be that the person hasn't been diagnosed or treated yet. So that's another reason why it's such a dangerous time. Because once someone is diagnosed and, start being treated, they gain what we call insight. So it doesn't mean that the symptoms go away. They can continue on, have a daily life while they still have psychotic episodes, except now they know that these are psychotic episodes. They understand what it is. They understand that these aren't real, right? And they can recognize oh, okay, that was just another one of the voices. That was just another hallucination. It's part of my illness. And so instead of reacting whoa, I have to, save myself from this monster that came through the door, they can be oh my gosh, I need to call my doctor and see about, changing my medication. So because they know they have that insight that sticks with them. So yeah, that awareness can make a huge difference in terms of behavior and risk. But Bert-Garrett, he didn't have that. He never got to the point where someone explained what was happening to him. It was after he blew up his family that Dr. William House looked back at everything and said, oh, yeah, he was in a temporary state of psychosis. So from Bert's perspective, in the spring and summer of 1909, his infectious and deadly illness was a very real thing. It was a threat to his entire family, and the only way to save them was to take them all out. And the terrifying part is that this didn't start as violence. He wasn't a violent man. This literally started as fear.
Huzzah!
Yay! Our first episode.
Wow! Here's some shout outs. Shout out to my brother Soren
for doing the couple of quotes for us
today. Shout out Family Search. Shout out Ancestry. Shout out newspapers.com. Shout out Find a Grave. Shout out the lady with the cardboard box
map at the Miller Cemetery in Silverton, where I've been there before.
Yes, you have. Follow our socials, Forgotten Felonies on Facebook and Forgotten_Felonies on Threads and Instagram. Yeah. Send us fan mail. Send us an email and episode suggestions to forgottenfelonies@gmail.com. And please leave us a review and rate us. Okay. The autumnal fern, I looked it up. It's non-toxic.
Well, then what are they talking about? Maybe they didn't know that then, so they were like, it had to have been the fern. Maybe they just found pieces of fern on the bottom of her shoe and they were like, she must have eaten it.
A nice salad.
Strange that she would put an autumnal fern in her salad.
Yeah, it says non-toxic to humans and animals.
Weird.